I'm Milton Nash. 5 years ago, chemists Stanley Pons and Martin Fleischmann rocked the scientific world with their startling claim that they had created a whole new form of energy. They said they'd captured the power of the sun in a test tube at room temperature. Cold fusion was the ultimate dream, an unlimited supply of safe, pollution-free energy. But within months, leading scientists dismissed cold fusion as a giant mistake. As we see in tonight's documentary, new data is still being collected in laboratories around the world, and Pons, Fleischmann, and a host of researchers insist they have discovered a major new source of energy. Tonight, filmmaker Jerry Thompson investigates. Is it science, or have several dozen scientists all flown too close to the sun?
Try to imagine a car that burns no fossil fuel. A car that runs pollution-free on the cheapest, most abundant natural resource on Earth.
The car can be run on any form of natural water. You can use rainwater, well water, seawater, ocean water, and if you don't have ocean water available, you can go ahead and use snow. Just use any form of natural water. You don't process it in any way. You add no chemicals to it. Just use ordinary rainwater.
One man who believes he's found a way of generating atomic power from water is Stanley Meyer, an Ohio inventor. He believes water will be the fuel of the future, and he's not the only one who does.
Couple more.
It was 5 years ago in Salt Lake City, Utah, that professors Stanley Pons and Martin Fleischmann told the world about cold fusion, nuclear energy from water at room temperature with no radiation.
Two relatively unknown electrochemists said in essence that they had captured the power of the sun, nuclear fusion, in a test tube no larger than this. An idea so heretical, so at odds with all the conventional wisdom of modern physics, it touched off one of the most exciting and bitter controversies in the history of science.
The cold fusion episode will be looked upon as one of the greatest travesties against justice and understanding that has ever occurred in the history of science.
I have labeled my book, Cold Fusion, the scientific fiasco of the century, simply because there's no experimental evidence at this point that any nuclear reaction products have been formed.
They say cold fusion must be real because so many people believe in it. Well, a lot of people believe in flying saucers.
It's been said that we have gone off the wall with our ideas, but that's absurd. Actually, we are extremely conventional scientists. I always say we are so conventional it is painful.
Far from Utah and away from the glare of public attention, in a kind of self-imposed exile from mainstream science, Pons and Fleischmann had ignored the critics and continued their work. In a brand new laboratory, they've begun to build a series of bigger and bigger cells, hoping eventually to build a power cell large enough to supply the average home.
So this cell, as you see, is very similar to the ones you see in the tanks behind us. So it has the capability of high precision and high accuracy measurements. But the method of heat transfer out of this cell can be raised now to much higher levels.
Dozens of other scientists around the world have joined Pons and Fleischmann in what amounts to a cold fusion underground. And the radical idea that was officially pronounced dead 5 years ago is still attracting multi-million-dollar investments.
If it had been anything else, we would have said, oh, you know, people don't want us to do it, forget it, just leave it alone. But this is not in that category. This is interesting science, new science, with a hint of a possibility of a very useful technology. And therefore, if you've got any integrity You don't give it up. You give it up if you find you are wrong, but as long as you believe that you are right, you have to continue with it, and you have to take the consequences.
The heart of the argument begins at the core of the sun, where extreme heat sends atoms crashing together. This hot fusion of matter generates enormous energy. Pons and Fleischmann believe they can do the same thing in a simple tabletop experiment at room temperature, hence cold fusion. Basically, they break apart molecules of water by electrolysis. Instead of ordinary water, they use deuterium oxide, or heavy water, and electrodes made of palladium. The theory is that palladium packs the deuterium atoms so tightly together, they fuse inside the electrode and release heat, but little or no radiation. News of the cold fusion experiments in 1989 made Pons and Fleischmann instant celebrities, and the price of palladium soared on the commodity exchanges.
Radio station has reported that the University of Moscow has just announced that it has successfully repeated the Pons-Fleischmann experiment.
The potential implications of a scientific breakthrough that can produce cold fusion are, at the least, in our judgment, spectacular.
Gentlemen, the world awaits the crucial details of your amazing claim. We all want this to work.
But not everyone felt like celebrating. Physicists who've been trying for more than 30 years to mimic the sun's hot fusion inside huge reactors worried that if Pons and Fleischmann were right, all of this might be abandoned. For a time, it seemed the U.S. Congress might divert $25 million from hot fusion to cold fusion. The state of Utah did spend $5 million to build and equip a National Cold Fusion Institute in Salt Lake City.
On top of doing the calorimetry we used to be doing, taking samples with electrolyte and the recombined and analyzing for tritium.
But fusion fever did not last long.
If you want to look around here, you'll see a feedback calorimeter in operation.
Because leading centers of physics, such as MIT and Boston, ran their own cold fusion cells and reported no evidence of excess heat. Scientists worked 6 months at the Harwell laboratory in Britain. They, too, said cold fusion was a big mistake.
First, you assume it's because you're not smart enough, or not going for long enough, or not doing things quite right. So you try yet more variations. And all the time, these claims are coming in from all sorts of people saying, oh, they can do it first time round. You know, you feel like a right Burke. Here are all these people saying, oh, they switch the cell on and bang, it works. Neutrons come out, or heat comes out, or tritium floods all over the place, and we found nothing.
The U.S. Department of Energy asked a panel of experts whether government money should be spent on cold fusion.
We wrote a very negative report and concluded that the results that were being presented to us were contrary to everything we had found out about nuclear physics over the last 50 years.
For most physicists, cold fusion would be nothing short of a miracle. Because by their nature, atoms don't want to fuse. Positively charged protons repel each other, and getting round this repulsion is quite the trick. In the sun, enormous temperatures set the atoms moving at great speed. They collide, forcefully overcoming the repulsion, fusing, and releasing lots of energy. To achieve the same effect inside the lattice of a palladium electrode at room temperature was considered simply impossible. Simply miraculous was the lack of deadly radiation, the normal side effect of a fusion reaction. In theory, to generate as much heat as Pons and Fleischmann claimed, the nuclear byproducts or radiation should have killed them. And for most physicists, 2 miracles was too much to swallow. In March 1990, cold fusion was written off in an editorial in the science journal Nature.
I think it will turn out that this is just spurious and unconnected with anything that you could call thermonuclear fusion, I think that, broadly speaking, it's dead. And it'll remain dead for a long, long time.
It seemed as though cold fusion would be relegated to the basement of some dim, dark archive, of interest only to historians of science. In fact, there is a cold fusion archive deep in the vaults of Cornell University in upstate New York.
The cold fusion case looks just like many other scientific controversies. You have an initial burst of excitement, and something new has been discovered. That's, after all, what scientists live for. Then you have to try to figure out what it means. And particularly if it's something that challenges the mainstream ideas, there will very quickly be denunciations and claims that this can't possibly be real. What happens next depends a bit on how easy it is to demonstrate how real the phenomenon is.
Convinced it was just a mistake, entrepreneurs began poking fun at cold fusion.
This is the Caltech cold fusion group, which of course was the major anti-groups. The test tube in this case has a dollar sign in it, and the water supporting that dollar sign, which is of course supposed to be the electrode, is pouring out, and the poor son down there has failed miserably. This is the cold fusion hat available at the University of Utah bookstore.
The Utah University Department of Cold Fusion Confusion. Fill cup with desired beverage. Insert swivel stick. Clip wire to swivel stick and insert other end of wire into cork on end of test tube. Guaranteed to work unless you are from Boston or have any affiliation with Boston physicists.
In '89, when we met this tremendous wall of criticism, we naturally again looked for the mistakes. You always say, where have we made a mistake? Because, of course, the phenomena were so strange. We knew that it was a very peculiar phenomenon which we had found, and that it would not be accepted. We have some very interesting correspondence about that, saying, more or less predicting what would happen. After we went public, and that's why, of course, we did not want to go public. Certainly not in 1989. 1990, maybe.
You knew you were going to be ridiculed?
Oh, of course, yes.
We had to leave. We had to leave. It was just impossible to go on.
Stan and Sheila Pons decided to leave the United States. The anti-cold fusion backlash affected even their children.
Our daughter was in school. At the time, she was 11, 12 years old. It's sort of a sensitive age. And some of the children said, oh, your dad's a fraud. Why did he do this to us? Why do we have Utah smeared like this because of your dad? And she didn't even know how to answer. So we had a choice of staying in America and not continuing on in science, or leaving America and continuing on. And that was difficult, because you don't know how much.
It wasn't difficult for me.
No, it was difficult for me.
I mean, that sort of choice wasn't difficult, but it was difficult to convince your family that they had to leave to preserve science, or to preserve what one man believes in science.
Are you bitter about America?
I'm bitter that I had to make such a stupid choice.
But would you give up your U.S. citizenship?
I would give up my U.S. citizenship.
I'm thinking of the things we have displayed to the public.
There were rumors that Fleischmann and Pons had fled Utah in disgrace. But that was far from the truth. Cold fusion simply went underground with the help of one of the world's richest men.
Yeah, we can continue forward. There's no problem.
Yeah.
Just when things looked really bleak for cold fusion, a rescue mission was launched by one of Japan's largest industrial corporations. Dr. Keiji Kunamatsu, a former student of Martin Fleischmann, played the go-between.
Mr. Fleischmann is a very creative person and very famous electrochemist who has done a lot of experiments and findings which was thought impossible by many people. One thing which I learned was
scientists must do something new, which nobody has done before. He said that is the spirit of scientists.
Dr. Kunimatsu arranged for Pons and Fleischmann to meet a wealthy man willing to take a long shot. Minoru Toyota, head of the Toyota Corporation.
I'm sure in his mind, he was already running his cars by the energy produced by cold fusion. Although he didn't understand the detail of the cold fusion, but probably he sensed that the cold fusion may be really a new energy source in near future. So in that case, he was in the position to decide the company policy. So he immediately probably decided in mind to start a new project.
Pons and Fleischmann were offered a new beginning in the quiet village of Valbonne in southern France, not far from Nice.
It was exciting to make a move. It was a relief to get away from that terrible atmosphere in the United States and to have the opportunity to work totally without public attention for a period of time.
Toyota's money built a brand new lab, hired staff, and gave Pons and Fleischmann the chance to scale up their experiments.
I think it probably is of interest to your viewers. We use very small electrodes. The heat is generated in this, and this is about 140, 150 watts of energy is generated in the system.
From that tiny little piece of palladium. So you put 30 watts into that and got 180 watts out of it.
170 under those conditions.
Pons and Fleischmann also persist in their view that there's so much heat coming out of the cells, it must be a nuclear reaction.
Around about June 1990, we had got to a point where we were approaching the levels which you get in a fast breeder reactor. That is kilowatts per cubic centimeter.
Now, let me see if I understand this. You're saying that in the more recent cold fusion reactions, you're getting the equivalent amount of power per cubic centimeter of palladium that you might get in a fast breeder reactor.
Then you do get in a fast breeder reactor.
Are you assuming, as you did before, that this is not a chemical reaction?
Well, it's impossible. I mean, completely impossible that that could have a chemical origin. People keep on trying to say that it can be chemical, but that there's no such chemistry, no. I mean, if it was chemical, I'd say eureka, fantastic. Storage. But it's not possible.
Storage is the latest.
Yeah, now people say you can store the energy. There's no such storage system known to man.
A major problem for the cold fusion underground is that everyone's doing the research in a slightly different way, which makes the results almost impossible to compare. Some labs have reported excess heat or bits of nuclear residue, but because there's no standardized way of doing it, skeptics still refuse to believe cold fusion really exists.
Of course, the other thing that you're required to accept in this field is that the fact that the results are irreproducible is an inherent part of it, and an acceptable part of it. One of the characteristics of the system. We weren't able to see it because the results are inherently reproducible. This, of course, makes it hard for people to confirm or deny. And this then makes it very like all sorts of other phenomena, like flying saucers. I mean, I could say, I just saw a flying saucer just go past the window just there. And you could say, well, you didn't. You see a flying saucer? Of course you didn't see it. You weren't looking.
If you do experimental research, especially in surface chemistry, you realize that processes are always irreproducible. A very large proportion of the chemical industry is based on catalysis. And that is a terrible fight. To get the catalysts to do the reactions you want to carry out is a big fight. And really, it's a triumph in the face of adversity. But people have got it under control. If you think of the development of microelectronics, in the chips, initially, the reproducibility was a fraction of a %.
But in California, Dr. Mike McCubry, a scientist working for a consortium of North America's major electric power companies, insists excess heat is reproducible. He says it's difficult, but it can be done.
As far as I'm concerned, there is a phenomenon to be studied. There is a mystery. I have observed something that I cannot explain, and I will continue to work until I understand it.
McCubry's team has found that if they force the electrode full of deuterium and keep it loaded that way for a specific amount of time, they reproduce the excess heat effect every time.
The issue of reproducibility, or its lack, has been frequently misunderstood in this field. The difficulty has been reproducing the conditions which produce the results, not reproducing the results. So if we meet the conditions that we have established, then we, in every case, observe excess heat.
The question of reproducibility has to go beyond one's own laboratory. If someone claims that they're making and doing cold fusion, he has to be able to produce a set of instructions that someone in an independent laboratory can reproduce those results. Reproducibility within one's own laboratory may simply be a result of systematic errors. And with regard to McCubry's results, McCubry claims that he has far too much energy to be due to a chemical reaction. On the other hand, 5 years have elapsed, and McCubry has no nuclear products. And so, if he's going to say it's not a chemical reaction, he has to concentrate on finding the nuclear products, which he has not been able to find.
McCubry agrees that he's not identified nuclear products, but he believes, like Fleischmann, that there is some kind of nuclear reaction. One early experiment provided an intriguing clue. They took a spent electrode from a cold fusion cell and exposed it to film.
Very much to our surprise, the second experiment that we performed, P2, after 12 days of exposure to the film, produced a pattern of bright illumination on the first layer of photographic film. For us, this was remarkable. We had had evidence of heat production, and now we had evidence, at least partial evidence, of a nuclear process. Clearly, the key to this business that we're investigating is whether or not there is a heat-producing phenomenon, whether or not there is a nuclear process, and whether the two are coupled. And we had now two pieces of the puzzle.
In Boston, another scientist has convinced himself that the excess heat of cold fusion is real, but not nuclear. In his spare time while attending classes at MIT, Randall Mills decided to recalculate quantum mechanics because he was sure that 70 years of conventional nuclear wisdom was wrong.
I wanted to know how things really worked because I was absolutely convinced that what was the present state of knowledge of how things worked on an atomic scale was inaccurate and incorrect. There's a long-standing mystery that's been perplexing astrophysicists, and that is the nature of the missing mass, or the dark matter of the universe.
As Dr. Mills drafted his own theory of the atom, he came up with the idea that hydrogen, the most abundant element in the universe, could have a second form in which the electron moves into a tighter orbit, closer to the nucleus, giving up energy in the process. According to Mills' theory, hydrogen, or water, could become the fuel of the next century and the salvation of mankind. An idea so extraordinary, he was afraid to drive home from university late at night.
I was extremely excited. And there were times when I was driving home and I'd be there, oh God, I'm the only one in the world that actually knows this solution. I'd call one of my friends and tell them, because I thought, well, what would happen if I crashed on the road and no one would ever know this and they wouldn't discover it for another 100 years.
After university, Dr. Mills moved to Pennsylvania, set up his own lab, and went to work. He wanted to test his new theory of the universe by creating the new form of hydrogen. He took ordinary water and passed a current through it, creating a device much like a cold fusion cell, except with nickel instead of palladium electrodes. He claims he did create the new kind of hydrogen and got a great deal of excess heat in the process.
Initially, there was very small amounts of excess heat, 10, 20%, and now over the years that has gone up both in magnitude and in percentage by about a factor of 1,000.
Eager to have another lab try to confirm his experiment, Dr. Mills rang up a local engineering firm only a few miles down the road. Scientists working at a company called Thermocore Incorporated, located in the Pennsylvania countryside near Lancaster, agree with Randall Mills that this new form of hydrogen energy is not nuclear. It's not cold fusion. Instead, they think it's some kind of unseen chemical process. But in their minds, the idea that it's not nuclear is almost entirely irrelevant because the power cells they're working on here, they claim, generate an enormous amount of excess energy.
Some of our better experiments with the electrolytic cell have generated as much as 1,000% excess heat. For example, if we put 1 watt into the cell, we will get 10 watts out. And that, with that kind of heat, we know that there is something going on, and it's not simply an experimental error.
You need to put back the electrode?
When we first got the excess energy, we weren't sure where that energy was coming from. And so one of the first things that we did was run experiments to determine if there was some degradation in the electrodes or the electrolyte, or if there was a nuclear source. And all of those tests showed that none of those possibilities were likely. There was no other source for this heat other than some unknown process.
Because Thermocore is a contractor for the U.S. military, news of this huge excess power claim caused quite a stir in Washington, and a senior scientist at one of the national laboratories went to work on it right away. He doesn't want to be identified because of the stigma of cold fusion research.
If work on this at a national laboratory were known, it would lessen the position of that laboratory. It would make it much more difficult to obtain funding or sustain your research activities. It could, in fact, close them down completely. What we saw at Thermocore was so exciting that we decided we had to get into this right away. We're very encouraged by the early results, and the program is continuing. I think Thermocore is onto something. It's just not clear to what extent it can be scaled up for full commercial use. That's the question that remains to be answered, and that's what Thermocore is wrestling with now.
But critics remain unconvinced. Nothing they've read or seen or heard from the cold fusion underground makes any sense to them. To believe in excess heat without radiation, to ignore or rewrite quantum mechanics flies in the face of too much conventional wisdom.
Earlier in this century, a very distinguished chemist by the name of Irving Langmuir defined pathological science as the science of things that aren't true. And I have labeled my book, Cold Fusion, the scientific fiasco of the century, simply because there's no experimental evidence at this point that any nuclear reaction products have been formed. Therefore, the claim that cold fusion is a nuclear reaction process without a commensurate amount of nuclear reaction products is simply pathological science.
It is, of course, perfectly true that there is pathological science. People do occasionally believe something which is just plainly impossible. And the history of the subject shows it is impossible. However, there are many instances in science where it is not pathological science, but it's pathological criticism, where the evidence, in the end, has been found to be absolutely correct, and the critics were pathological. And that is always forgotten. So the question here, the conundrum we have here, is it pathological science or is it pathological criticism? And I would suggest that it is now time for the critics, those who have done some experiments themselves, to go back and investigate their own data and see whether it would not be more reasonable to say that they had observed the same phenomena as we had observed.
One man has gone back to check the data, and what he found made him so angry he quit his job in protest. Dr. Eugene Mallove, former chief science writer for the MIT News Service, believes data was manipulated in order to debunk cold fusion.
The whole point of science and technology is to seek new things.
new anomalies that have to be explained and to be used for the betterment of humanity. Here we had one in cold fusion. And instead of investigating it thoroughly and getting to the bottom of it, what we had were top-level people at MIT disparaging cold fusion, attacking cold fusion, manipulating the press against cold fusion, doing everything possible to show the public and the world that cold fusion was nonsense.
MIT's hot fusion lab was one of the first major laboratories to conduct independent experiments and the first to claim that there was no evidence for cold fusion.
And here's the light water data showing...
About a year after the experiment was done, Dr. Malov saw a graph of the raw data for the first time. The spiky line of temperature readings seems to show excess heat above the baseline. But the graph that was actually published shows an average of heat measurements right on the baseline, suggesting no excess heat. When the two graphs were superimposed, it looked as if the published data, the curve shown in blue, did not match the raw data.
When I saw this data, I was outraged. I couldn't believe my eyes. For years, the MIT results showing no excess heat have been held forth to the world as an example of an experiment that didn't get excess heat. This is not true. And the fact that that experiment continues to this day to be used by the Patent Office and many other people as examples of how cold fusion failed in 1989 is a travesty.
The man who supervised those experiments back in the fall of 1989 was Dr. Ronald Parker, who says raw data is always processed before publication.
What you finally see in journals generally has some processing associated with it. And so, yes, it's correct to say that what appeared in the paper looks different than the raw signal coming out of the detector itself. This is a normal situation, completely normal. But it was our judgment that in processing the data, we didn't change its content. We only made it clearer.
Asked about Dr. Malov's suggestion that the data was manipulated to show no excess heat, Dr. Parker replied,
"It's complete nonsense, utterly ridiculous and without foundation. And any allegations along those lines, I believe, are made by people that don't understand how measurements are made."
At Cornell University's Cold Fusion Archive, Dr. Bruce Lowenstein says this is a classic slanging match, like many others in the history of science.
Science is often portrayed as being objective, as being a purely rational and objective inquiry into nature. In fact, sociologists and historians and philosophers of science over the last generation have been showing how much science depends on individual value judgments, on the ways that scientists get their funding or frame their problems, how much of their own concerns enter into their research. And that leads to a science that is not arrived at through this textbook rational approach. Instead, it's a science which is shaped fundamentally by the humans who are doing it.
As if claims of pathological science, processed data, and the end of quantum mechanics were not enough, tragedy was about to strike a cold fusion lab. At Christmas 1991, MIT in Boston invited Martin Fleischmann to talk about the latest cold fusion experiments. What he said had a profound effect on one member of the audience, a researcher for the U.S. military, a man who does not want to be identified.
I attended that talk, and we learned that a cold fusion cell is extremely dangerous. You have a lot of stored hydrogen, a great density of stored hydrogen. Fleischmann admitted that he no longer worked with bulk samples because he viewed them as too dangerous. If you store a large quantity of hydrogen in a palladium lattice and you drop it or you knock it, it can spontaneously explode. And if that palladium apparatus is inside a containment vessel, it can act like a grenade.
And there was such a grenade waiting to blow in California.
We learned that McCubre's lab on the West Coast was still doing experiments with bulk palladium samples.
Because of the Christmas holiday, urgent phone calls to Mike McCubre's lab at Stanford went unanswered.
I called all that week in the hopes that someone would come in and I could alert them to the danger. They didn't return until the first day after New Year's in 1992, and I called early that morning. I called as late as 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. However, that was still just getting to 8 o'clock out at Stanford, and there was no answer. At 11 o'clock, I went off to lunch to play in an over-30 basketball game, and that lasted some time. And when we returned, I tried to make those calls again, and it was already too late.
That morning, there was an explosion at Stanford Research International. A talented young chemist, Dr. Andrew Riley, who used to work at the National Cold Fusion Institute, was killed. 2 others were injured, including Mike McCoubrey.
Obviously, as a consequence of something as traumatic as that, you reevaluate what it is that you're doing and why you're doing it. And each one of us independently examined whether what we were doing was important enough to warrant continuing with the research. And in each case of the people in the research group, we felt that what we were doing was far too important to put aside, despite what was obviously a potential consequence and what obviously had occurred.
Today, cold fusion experiments are padlocked behind a metal grid of half-inch thick, blast-proof safety barriers, the result of a special California regulation enacted because of the Stanford explosion. It took a year to recover and rebuild the experiments, but funding from the power companies continues, and McCoubrey is still reporting excess heat. At the Fleischmann and Pons lab in France, new cells are under construction as they try to engineer a system to maintain high levels of heat for longer periods of time.
A device this big could supply a household.
Something on this size could run around 20,000 watts output continuous.
20,000 watts?
Yeah, 20 kilowatts, which is approximately what you need in a house to working on a continuous basis.
How long would it last?
Well, theoretically, consuming all of the materials and not consuming the palladium, I think Fleischmann's calculation is on the order of 10 to the 50 years, 100,000 years.
100,000 years.
Hopefully. We'll settle for 10 right now.
Just before Christmas 1993, Japanese government and industry leaders invited Fleischmann and Pons to Tokyo to celebrate another $30 million for research. The pioneers of cold fusion were to be guests of honor at the classic Japanese wedding of government money and corporate expertise.
New building. We come to here to pray at the New Year's Eve. This is a yes.
After paying their respects at the shrine that overlooks the new hydrogen energy project in Sapporo, Martin Fleischmann and his old friend Keiji Kunamatsu took a tour of Japan's latest cold fusion lab. In addition to Toyota, now Hitachi, Toshiba, and Mitsubishi are involved, along with more than 100 university-based research groups.
That is the best compromise you can have for...
Fleischmann and Pons delivered 6 of their own working power cells to be tested here and independently verified. They've given themselves a series of deadlines over the next several years, a step-by-step plan to scale up the power output of their cells. They call it Project Icarus.
The Japanese are much more inclined to go for the long shots. There are plenty of people in the world who are going for the immediate benefit, and that's not their style. They go for long shots in technology.
Well, we go for the short-term profit.
Yes, and they go for, now increasingly, for a long shot in science.
A long night of celebration ended as everyone drank a toast to the audacious idea of flying too close to the sun.
For the success of this new hydrogen energy center, Icarus 1. And don't forget, our wings are stuck on the superglue. And the success of our sponsors. Yes. Kampai. 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 Kampai.
In the United States, entrepreneurs are trying to catch up with Japan's cold fusion program. Fred Yeager, president of a company called Inaco, has traveled around the world and spent millions of dollars sponsoring research and buying up the applications for cold fusion patents that have not even been granted.
Our company has acquired the exclusive worldwide rights to the original Pons-Fleischmann patents, and we try to acquire the pioneer position in each of various technologies, be they solid phase, liquid, the aqueous cells, or the gas phase. You can't afford not to get involved at this from a patent point of view, because even though the technology or the science isn't known, we're to the point where you could replicate and amplify it. If you wait until then to get into the patent field, it's too late. Suddenly, everybody knows the value of this. The only reason we can survive and do what we're doing now is because it is unknown.
Backed primarily by a Texas millionaire, Yeager represents a group of scientists in several countries who are joining forces to protect themselves from predators, bigger companies that might try to dominate or take over the cold fusion business later on.
The obvious dream from a commercial sense, if this is successful and we are able to get a handle on the science and license this technology to a worldwide audience, the return is billions of dollars in license fees.
But Inaco is not alone. Cold fusion fever is spreading all over again.
Our intent is to build a boiler. This is our first attempt at a commercial boiler unit. We've seen no reason why it can't be made safe.
We had marked success.
And it'll either be for home heating use or for commercial use.
These cells represent the embodiment of the boiler of the future.
It could be worth millions or even billions.
From our results, it's absolutely apparent that water will be the ultimate fuel of the future. The water will be used as a source of hydrogen, and the hydrogen will be used in high-temperature, high-pressure gas cells. So this represents a heat engine that can go into existing equipment for propulsion, for the generation of electricity, and any other use.
And there's one person who firmly believes he's beaten the rest of the world to it. In Ohio, behind this garage door lies one man's dream, the world's first water-powered car. Created by amateur inventor Stanley Meyer.
This dune buggy operates around 65 miles per hour on around 60 miles per gallon of water. It's very efficient as opposed to running on gasoline. One time I was offered well over $1 billion in cold cash to buy out the technology, to suppress it. Of course, my interest is to get it into the economies of the world and do it very quickly. We have developed the technology over the years, and we've legalized the technology, and now what we're trying to do is coordinate with industry to design kits that can be fitted to an existing internal combustion engine, whether it's a gasoline engine or even a diesel engine.
His kit seems to be a high-voltage variation of the cold fusion cell. Skeptics think it's nothing more than a battery storage device. But a New York millionaire is paying to have it all tested in a secret lab somewhere else. And although the car was not running the day we came to film, pictures were taken earlier by a local television station.
The status of cold fusion is rather like a gold rush. The data has been pouring in so rapidly with a variety of different radiations reported and different byproducts, and we're tantalized by this scientifically. It's just a wonderful opportunity to use all your scientific training to try and understand what's going on here. And we think we're making some headway in that area right now. We're very excited. You can hardly wait to get up in the morning to come in and to continue in this line of research. It's extremely exciting, and it's accelerating. It's just a wonderful time to be a scientist.
The mainstream of scientists will tell you that a conclusion has been reached. Cold fusion is dead. Some people will even say always was dead, but in any case, it's certainly dead now. But there are a number of people who, by almost any description of what a scientist is, are real professional scientists who are continuing to investigate cold fusion. There's an area of research now. It's cold fusion research. It's not a big area. It's not a well-funded area, but it's an area, and it's now part of the entire scientific research picture.
The whole point is that 4 of these rods will power quite a large house. The average house in England uses 10 kilowatts.
So you know you're in for about the output of about 2 of these.
I think it's inevitable that if you have a persuasive, articulate, charismatic man who believes that he's made a very important discovery that challenges scientific orthodoxy, it's inevitable that his students, his colleagues, will have to take a view. Are we for him or against him? And in a way, it becomes quite quickly like the founding of a religion. You have a charismatic leader who persuades some people who become his followers that they have seen the true light. And there's a large element of that, I fear, in what's happened with cold fusion.
I don't care what people think about me. I prefer them, naturally. I prefer it if they think well of me, but I don't care if they think badly of me. And since we know we're right, why should we care about what people put on the email? It's just ludicrous. Let them go on and do it. We'll get on with our work.
And we've learned a lot, but the experimental evidence is still absolutely true.
But certainly, he would have preferred, I would have preferred, I think he would have been quite happy to have the research carried out in America to start with.
Absolutely.
I mean, selling out to foreigners comes along after nobody else. America said no, 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 no.
Selling out is a word which we will be accused of. We will be accused of selling out. And the fact is that this is the truth. This is science. The American system does not believe in promoting innovative science. It believes that
Therefore, they will not have any.
they will not have it.
I mean, you only get what you pay for.
Le plateau fruits, s'il vous plaît.
Oui.
Gâteau chocolat.
Gâteau chocolat.
Le deux.
Chocolat praliné.
Oui.
Martin was facing a very lovely retirement. He was facing a very lovely wind down of his career, 5 years ago.
Le deux. Je dois payer. Combien?
166 francs, s'il vous plaît.
This looked like a very good point for him. It would be sort of a crowning point in his career. And the reasons why it went bad have nothing to do with the validity of the science. I'm just very disappointed that a man of his stature was treated this way.
Other people think we are completely mad, or they think that we pose a threat. Or they know that we are right and think we pose a threat. I don't know any other real explanation for this antipathy.
And now here's a preview of the documentary we have coming up next week on Witness.
His name is...
It was the dawn of Canadian television, 1952. And the CBC was on the air.
It was magic time. You sit in your own living room and all these stars come to visit you.